This time on combat ships. The Battle of Trafalgar. Huge ships going head-to-head in the greatest sea battle of the age of sail. With hundreds of guns ablaze.
They've got both sides working the guns, and enemy shot coming through, but they would load and refire again at point-blank range.
Britain versus France and Spain in deadly conflict.
Naval battle at this time was like entering hell. Gun decks were full of smoke, blood, gore, your dying comrades. This was war at its most vicious, immediate, and destructive.
A battle of legends.
Adoring crowds followed him everywhere. He was really considered the one person in England who was going to save them from the French.
With a legacy that has lasted centuries. Combat ships. Fast, effective.
His orders were to find the British and to pick a fight.
Going right to the heart of the battle.
The Marines have always thought of themselves as the spear point of United States military power. Their whole doctrine of combat was to go fast, hit hard, get it over with in a hurry.
Combat ships have changed the world.
She gained her freedom. Now she's going down a river with an army. She was like, we're about to show you what we're working with.
Thanks to clever design, raw firepower, and the heroism of their crews.
The rule of thumb on a frigate is you can lose 2 spaces and stay afloat. But if you lose a third, you go to Davy Jones's locker in a hurry.
October 21st, 1805. Off Cape Trafalgar on the southern coast of Spain, a huge fleet of 33 French and Spanish ships stare down an approaching British force. Age-old enemies facing off in a climactic, decisive battle for the ages.
Centuries of rivalries between Britain and France boiled over and culminated in early 19th century in the Battle of Trafalgar.
Both nations jostled for power. France was dominant in Europe, and Britain, with its powerful navy, was colonizing the world.
It was a battle that would decide who was going to control the world's oceans.
This epic clash will see 60 of history's greatest combat ships go head-to-head. The most famous is HMS Victory.
HMS Victory is a 3,500-ton killing machine. And they seem romantic and nostalgic to us today, but make no mistake, these ships were built for war.
Victory is an engineering marvel, one of the biggest ships of her time. It took 6,000 oak trees to build her, clearing 100 acres of woodland.
These ships were designed to hold as many guns as possible. They're essentially just a mobile gun platform. Victory was designed to carry 100 guns. The largest, the 32-pounders, were on the lower gun deck. Then you've got 24-pounders on the middle gun deck and 12-pounders on the upper gun deck, quarterdeck, and forecastle.
Ships like Victory were designed to position themselves parallel to their target, so they could fire all the guns on one side of the ship at the same time. This was known as a broadside.
These guns could fire a 32-pound iron shot over 2,000 yards at a speed of 500 miles an hour. And when a whole broadside was fired, that's the equivalent of the size of a small car. That's 1.5 tons of iron being shot out of the side of the ship.
Combat ships of the time were given ratings based on the number of guns they carried. From the first rates, like Victory, that carried over 100, to the sixth rates, that carried as few as 20. Only the first three rates, ships with 64 guns or more, would fight in fleet battles. They were known as ships of the line.
A ship of the line is any ship that's large enough to fight in the line of battle. Now, the line of battle is the name given to the tactics at the time where two opposing fleets would sail in parallel lines, firing at each other in relatively close range.
Being in position to inflict the most damage meant being exposed to equally brutal fire from the enemy. So picking your battles was crucial. In a time when ships were powered only by sails, wind direction was crucial in these line battles. The fleet positioned upwind had the initiative, the so-called weather gauge. They could decide when and where to begin the battle. But the fleet downwind, in the leeward gauge, had one advantage. It could turn, fill its sails, and escape. The man making the key decisions for the British fleet at Trafalgar is the legendary Admiral Horatio Nelson. Standing on the decks of HMS Victory, he leads his 27 ships straight toward the guns of the combined fleet.
Horatio Nelson was the class idea of leadership. Fearless, intelligent.
I think Nelson was peerless amongst military leaders of all time, not just his own time.
Nelson first made a name for himself in 1797, during the Battle of Cape St. Vincent. A British fleet led by Admiral Jarvis took on a much larger force of Spanish ships. The British fleet were in a single line of battle, maneuvering to engage the enemy, but they were too slow, and the Spanish were close to escaping. When Nelson realized this, he took the initiative, broke formation, and moved to intercept some of the Spanish ships.
He boarded one Spanish ship and he led the charge with his sword. He was nothing if not brave. And then there was another Spanish ship, an even larger one on the other side, and so he boarded that too.
And captured both.
And that example of heroism made him an instant celebrity and made him famous amongst the fleet and gave him a kind of aura of leadership and personal heroism that never left him.
But Nelson would also taste bitter defeat, a year later during another battle with the Spanish.
He was shot through the upper right arm, and the injury was so severe that it required his arm to be amputated just below the shoulder. I think Nelson really thought that for a long time that he was invincible and he could overcome anything that he met with. But after he was injured at Tenerife, the loss of his arm was just a constant reminder of his failure.
Nelson always put himself in the line of fire. Now aboard Victory, he once again leads from the front into the hailstorm of cannonballs. On October 21st, 1805, off Cape Trafalgar, Nelson hoped to annihilate the enemy fleet and turn the age-old war with France in Britain's favor. A war that France was winning thanks to their own legendary leader, Napoleon Bonaparte.
Napoleon was brave, charismatic, ambitious, a strategic genius. end of 18th century, 1796, 1797, that is the time Napoleon is rising to power. And he is running through northern Italy, western Germany, Poland, Spain. He sought European dominance.
And more. Napoleon also set his sights on Egypt, and even Britain's colonial crown jewel, India. To get them, he needed his fleet to control the Mediterranean, the gateway to these territories. In the spring of 1798, Britain sent Nelson to retake control of this crucial sea. After 3 months of searching for the French fleet, Nelson finally found it anchored in Abukir Bay, off the Egyptian coast. The French fleet of 13 ships of the line was anchored in a defensive formation.
It was an impregnable position, or so it seemed. Ships lined in order, the sea on one side, dangerous shoals on the other. So they were guarded on one side because any enemy attacking them would surely run aground.
Nelson, too, had 13 combat ships to launch his attack. The imminent Battle of the Nile looked evenly matched. With the sun setting, Nelson knew he had a chance to shift the odds in his favor.
It could be really risky to conduct a fleet battle at night because you ran the risk of firing upon your own ships, of collisions, of entanglements, or even running aground. But when Nelson spotted the French anchored in Abukir Bay on the afternoon of August 1st, he knew he had caught them by surprise, and he absolutely was not willing to give them 10 or 12 hours to prepare or to escape.
The French weren't expecting them and were actually all just sat at anchor. They weren't cleared for action. They saw the British fleet approaching, and then suddenly all hell let loose.
Nelson instructed his captains to use the favorable wind to engage and focus fire on the front of the French line to overwhelm them. The French ships in the rear would be unable to sail upwind to support the front. But Nelson's plans always left room for maneuver.
He expected his captains to use their initiative. He gave them general instructions. He showed them the kinds of things he wanted doing, and he expected them to think for themselves.
His method was rewarded when Captain Foley, in the lead ship, spotted an opportunity.
The first ship, rather than go on the seaward side of the enemy, decided he would sail inshore of them, towards the shoals, risking his ship, and a maneuver the French would never think any attacking enemy would ever do. And as a result, the French didn't have cannons loaded on their side, didn't have gun crews ready to counter that attack. So the British could almost fire at will at the French.
4 ships followed shoalside. The rest positioned themselves seaside. 8 British ships now engulfed 5 French vessels in gunfire.
Quite early on, the ships at the northern end of the French line are being devastated by being attacked from both sides. Then the big flagship, the first-rate L'Orient, catches fire and blows up. And then the rest of the fleet are dealt with afterwards. The battle goes on to some extent into the following day. But really, by the evening, the French had been well and truly hammered.
They were unable to counter this lightning attack from the British, this unexpected, fast, and hard pummeling that the British gave them.
Of the 13 French ships, 11 were destroyed or captured. Only 2 escaped.
One stroke, Nelson had regained control over the Mediterranean. It made him the greatest naval hero that Britain had ever known.
It proved the British were the ultimate naval power, due not just to its intrepid leaders, but also the crews that sailed the ships and manned the guns.
The British Navy had a superiority in its manpower, if not its ships. The thing that made it a great navy was its people, the people that served on board.
The Royal Navy was hungry for manpower, employing 120,000 personnel by the time of Trafalgar, more than any other navy. An appetite that could not be sustained by Brits alone.
The Victory, like all other ships at Trafalgar, had a multi-ethnic crew. There were 22 nationalities on board the Victory, including Brazilians, Danes, Jamaicans, an extraordinary spectrum of humanity that's on board this one vessel.
Many of the black sailors were free men at a time when slavery was still rife in British territories.
It's a time when Britain is, in fact, in the late 18th century, the largest trader in human lives across the Atlantic. So the Royal Navy finds itself in the bizarre position of being, on one hand, the protector of British interests and commerce, including human lives in the Caribbean, and on the other hand, it is also the largest employer of free black labor in the world.
Although the Royal Navy made it near impossible for black sailors to rise up the ranks to become officers, they certainly made use of their skills.
The presence of multi-ethnic labor points to the reality that despite the racist conditions which prevailed throughout the British Empire and British possessions, the Royal Navy was fundamentally pragmatic. It was looking for solutions to its problems of manpower, of local knowledge, regional skills, languages, and all other special skills that non-white or other populations could bring on board.
Once on the ships, these international crews underwent constant training. The Royal Navy wanted to ensure they were combat ready.
More than any other navy, the Royal Navy was constantly at operation. It was blockading other navies into ports. It was maintaining convoy duties to protect trade. So there was always a sense that this was a busy navy that was constantly at preparation.
They put extra emphasis on drilling the gun crews.
These guns were absolutely massive and huge and heavy, and I don't think people realize it took 12 people to prepare and actually run them out for action.
Each 32-pound gun was solid iron, weighing 3.5 tons, and recoiled violently after each shot.
Gun drill was important for two reasons. First of all, it meant you could keep firing even in the thick of battle. But also the other thing that gun drill did was it increased the rate of fire, how quickly you could load and fire the gun. If you have two ships with the same number of the same size of guns, you might think they're evenly matched. But if one ship can fire their guns every 90 seconds, but the other ship takes 3 minutes to load and fire, that first ship has twice as many guns. Because it doesn't matter how many guns you have, what matters is how many cannonballs are hitting the enemy. And so the more rapidly that you can aim and fire, the more effective you can be.
The Battle of the Nile was an awesome demonstration of the superiority of the British crews over their enemy. This resounding defeat was a huge blow to Napoleon, but it did not stop him. He turned France into the dominant power on mainland Europe in the following years.
Great Britain was the only thing standing between Napoleon and his ambition of European domination. And since Britain wanted to stop Napoleon, Napoleon had this idea of invading Britain.
Napoleon wanted to knock out his biggest, most threatening enemy for good. That was a very hard task to accomplish. It would require getting a battle fleet into the Channel and giving enough cover for Napoleon to bring 140,000 troops or so across the English Channel.
Napoleon ordered the creation of a huge fleet to once and for all settle the score with Britain. A move that set the stage for the Battle of Trafalgar. In early 1805, a combined fleet of 33 French and Spanish ships of the line massed in the Spanish harbor of Cadiz. It was an awesome collection of combat ships, which included the pride of the Spanish Navy, the Santissima Trinidad.
Santissimo Trinidad was renowned as the biggest warship afloat ever in the age of sail. It packed a huge amount of guns, 130. No other warship in the world had such an amount of firepower.
The British Admiralty could not leave this threat unchecked. They sent Nelson to deal with it. On September 14, 1805, he left England on board HMS Victory. Nelson had a clear goal. In a briefing to the Prime Minister, he wrote,
"It is annihilation that the country wants, and not merely a splendid victory."
To achieve this, Nelson decided he could not rely on the old line of battle tactics.
The problem was trying to inflict decisive damage on an enemy fleet that also sailed in line was extremely difficult. Battles could go on all day, in certain occasions more than one day. So therefore, the more novel commanders decided there must be a better way. What you needed to do was to outmaneuver your opponent, and this meant that you'd have to take risks.
Nelson was a firm believer in this new doctrine. When he arrived off Cadiz on September 28, 1805, he invited the captains of his fleet onto HMS Victory to present them with his plan.
A key document for explaining Nelson's tactics at Trafalgar is this small sketch, which he will have produced surrounded by his fellow officers in the wardroom of Victory. And in the excitement of explaining his plans, he's picked up his pen and just dashed out a quick diagram that explains how he imagines the battle will take place.
Nelson believed the French and Spanish combined fleet would be in a standard line formation. He wanted 2 British columns of ships to cut this line. This simple plan became known as the Nelson Touch. It split the British fleet in 2. Nelson would lead one squadron, Admiral Collingwood the other.
Nelson's basic plan deals with the combined fleet as a line which he is going to cut into 3. His squadron will come in and chop off the head of the line, which will sail away and have to turn round in order to come back into the battle later.
A maneuver that could take hours if the wind was against them.
Collingwood's column will cut here and then fan out to deal with the rear of the line, individual ships picking off their targets. So Nelson's plan is designed to give the British a moment of numerical superiority before the enemy vanguard can come back into battle.
By October 1805, Nelson had 27 ships of the line waiting beyond the horizon, ready for battle. In Cadiz, the French Admiral Villeneuve, commander of the Franco-Spanish fleet of 33 ships, knew the British were out there. All Nelson could do was wait. Attacking the fleet in a heavily defended harbor would have been suicide. He sent his 6 smaller, faster vessels, including 4 frigates, to monitor the combined fleet.
A frigate was a small warship. It was cut down so it was maneuverable. Unlike a big lumbering ship of the line, it could maneuver very quickly.
The frigate class of combat ships was the backbone of the Royal Navy.
Frigates were fundamental. They were the eyes of the fleet. Frigates could go much closer to an enemy harbour, see what was going on, see if any preparations were being made for a fleet to leave, and feed back information to the bigger ships of the line that were lying off harbour, ready to intercept any enemy fleet.
But frigates were more than just scouts for the battle fleets.
Frigates were the workhorses of the Royal Navy and the mainstay of the British Empire. Because they were small, fast, maneuverable, and quite vicious at fighting, they were excellent for convoying trade. They were good for raiding the trade of your enemy.
The frigates would take prizes, which were usually merchant ships, and then these would either be sold off or the goods on board would then be sold off, and the money would then be split out amongst the captain, and then it would sort of filter down just through smaller increments to each of the officers and the crew.
And their commanders were a special breed.
Frigate captains were the most enterprising, ambitious captains and officers in the Royal Navy. And they were quite glamorous figures at the time and wanted to use their own initiative and to be bold and daring and get into battle.
One of the most daring of his time was a man named John Perkins.
John Perkins' most audacious attack on another vessel would have been the taking of the French ship, the Duquesne, in 1804. Perkins was in a 32-gun frigate, and he took on the Duquesne, which had 74 guns. He did eventually have some backup, but the fact that he had the audacity to even think of taking on a ship of more than twice his firepower is extraordinary and typical of the man.
Born in Jamaica, Perkins also knew the Caribbean waters like the back of his hand. Yet even with this courage and skill, he was an unlikely commander.
John Perkins was a person of mixed race, so he's very unusual in as much as he made it through all the hoops and ladders which would have stopped and hindered other non-white men.
The Royal Navy rarely promoted people of color. He was its first black commissioned officer, and he made his presence felt.
Of Perkins, it was said that he annoyed the enemy more than any other officer by his feats of gallantry and the immense number of prizes that he took. And we are talking about an immense number of prizes. 315 enemy ships either taken, sunk, or destroyed, and more than 3,000 prisoners, which is a phenomenal achievement.
But his achievements did not always protect him from the bigotry of the time.
One of the lieutenants of the Tartar, in which Perkins is commanding, declares that it is a cursed disgrace for us British officers to be under the command of a bloodthirsty coloured captain. So clearly, at officer level, there was discomfort at his seniority, and this must have been something which accompanied him throughout his career.
Nelson, too, had mastered his naval prowess commanding frigates in the Caribbean. The bold and daring qualities never left him. As the admiral of a fleet, he waited on word from his scouting frigates. By now, they had reported that Villeneuve's fleet had 33 ships of the line.
Information would be fed back to fleets by signals, almost like a relay race of one frigate being able to communicate to another, and bring back clear, concise information to the fleet commander.
In Cadiz, Villeneuve received orders from Napoleon to leave port and sail to deliver troops to Naples, Italy. Outside the safety of Cadiz harbor, Nelson's frigates lay waiting, ready to signal the British fleet. On October 20th, 1805, after nearly a month of waiting, Nelson finally got the signal. Villeneuve was on the move.
It took the best part of an entire day for Villeneuve's fleet to leave Cadiz. On the 20th of October, they were fully at sea, but had been spotted by the scouting British frigates. They were able to alert Nelson. By this stage, Villeneuve knew he had been spotted and had turned around in a slightly chaotic manoeuvre, heading back towards the safety of Cadiz. But too late. By this stage, the main British fleet had formed up into its two squadrons, and the stage was set for what would be the Battle of Trafalgar.
Hoping to split the enemy's line, the two British columns headed straight for the broadsides of the combined fleet. The riskiest moment for Nelson.
What he essentially wanted to do was to use his biggest and best ships, HMS Victory an HMS Royal Sovereign as battering rams to batter into the French line.
Although placing your best ship at the front allows the maximum firepower eventually to be delivered, it does have its risk. As the ship approaches the enemy line, it is being bombarded by broadsides from the enemy fleet. And there's a real risk of potentially catastrophic damage, meaning that the ship might be taken out of the battle.
That risk becomes reality. The wind is light. Nelson's column crawls toward the French line with Nelson and the Victory at its head.
Now, it might seem foolhardy for Nelson to place himself in one of those ships, but of course Nelson needed to be seen to be leading from the front. His men and his officers expected that, and he wouldn't have been happy in any other position.
As Victory took a beating, the 2nd British column catches a more favorable breeze.
Collingwood's squadron is the first to engage the enemy, taking advantage of the fresher winds. He is able then to break the enemy line, deliver his raking broadside, and then meanwhile the captains behind him will fan out, bringing the fight to the enemy. At the same time, Nelson's squadron is very slowly advancing towards the enemy line. He is now looking for his target, which will be the French flagship, the Bucentaure. Other ships will also be looking for their targets.
At 1 p.m., after enduring an hour of enemy fire, Victory breaks the Franco-Spanish line just below Admiral Villeneuve's Bucentaure. Below decks, Victory's portside gun crews were finally in the perfect position to pull the trigger.
When it broke the line, it was able to do what Nelson had planned. It was able to rake the enemy, to fire through the stern, its undefended portion, with its maximum firepower.
If you fire down the stern, there's almost nothing to stop the shot going all the way along the deck, which is why Bucentaure is thought to have lost over 200 men just from that single broadside.
As Victory dealt a devastating blow to Bucentaure, its bow rammed another French ship, the Redoutable, and became entangled.
Now they've got both sides working the guns, and enemy shot coming through, but they would load and refire again at point-blank range.
This is how Nelson liked to fight, close and with the hardest possible force.
The Battle of Trafalgar began to descend into chaos. More and more ships from Collingwood's column were engaging the French and Spanish ships, but Victory was still alone, surrounded by the enemy. The next British ship was still minutes away. Victory's gunners frantically fired every weapon they had.
To be part of that kind of battle was like entering hell. You wouldn't be able to see much, the smoke, the noise would deafen you for days afterwards. You would be surrounded by your fellows dying, people being decapitated.
To understand just how deadly this gunfire was, the Vasa Museum in Stockholm, Sweden, home to a 17th century combat ship, created an exact replica of one of her 24-pounder guns and took it to a firing range. Fred Hawker was one of the lead historians on the project.
We fired a total of 54 rounds to assess range, velocity, accuracy, and effect. To test effect, we built a full-scale copy of a section of the side of Vasa, essentially one gun port and the hull structure around it, and then punched a series of holes in it with that cannon in order to assess splinter damage, penetration, and what the effect inside the ship would have been being hit with cannonballs.
The tests proved these guns packed a punch.
There was no part of the ship structure of Vasa that would stop a 24-pound cannonball. And in fact, what we discovered is virtually every round that we fired had enough residual velocity that it would have gone through the other side of the ship as well.
Aside from cannonballs flying across the decks, crews had to contend with the splinters each shot produced as it crashed through the wooden hull.
The vast majority of splinters you created by shooting through the thin part of Vasa's side would bounce off your clothing. However, if you hit a spot that has big internal reinforcing timbers, knees, standards, rider timbers on the inside, so that instead of going through 45 centimeters of oak, the ball is going through 75 centimeters of oak. That allows that shock wave to spread out over a bigger area, and then you break off really big chunks of those internal timbers. And so instead of getting 10 millimeter or 10 gram matchsticks, you get big chunks that weigh kilograms, traveling at 200 meters per second. They're deadly. You could say, in a perverse way, that your best defense against a heavily armed ship is to be a lightly built ship.
But at Trafalgar, the hulls were thicker and the guns were bigger.
Considering what we discovered firing a 24-pound ball at 17th century ship structure, in light of the heavier guns firing at thicker hull sides at Trafalgar, I would expect the result of Victory's lower and middle tier to have been devastating on French and Spanish ships. I can't imagine that there was any ship that could stop one of those balls. And because those structures are so much thicker than what we were firing at, I would imagine that the size of splinters being generated are much larger and thus much more deadly.
But Victory's gunners got as well as they gave. Marine Lieutenant Rotley, stationed on the middle deck of Victory, would later recall,
"A man should witness a battle in a three-decker from the middle deck, for it beggars all description. It bewilders the senses of sight and hearing. There was the fire from above, the fire from below, besides the fire from the deck I was upon. The guns recoiling with violence, reports louder than thunder, the decks heaving and the sides straining. I fancied myself in the infernal regions, where every man appeared a devil."
To keep your nerve under that kind of chaos and slaughter called upon ultimate resources.
The British understood your best strategy for survival is offensive. Serve your gun as efficiently as you can to subdue the enemy as quickly as you can so he will quit firing his guns at you. And that's what practice was about, what all of the gun drill was about, was to imprint the actions needed to load and fire the gun in muscle memory so that you could do it even when you were terrified, because that was the way to survive. That was your best chance of surviving a naval engagement, was to win.
On Victory's upper deck, the situation was just as chaotic. Nelson watched the battle unfold. Victory was still lashed to the French ship Redoutable, whose captain Lucas saw his only chance of survival in a boarding attempt.
So this is the quarterdeck. This is like the nerve center of the ship. This is where Nelson commanded the fleet. You've got smoke everywhere. It may seem like chaos, but it's organized chaos. These men are well drilled. Got Marines with small arms trying to repel the French from boarding. You've got men on the gun crews at the guns, firing rapidly. And it was at this point, Nelson was shot by a sniper. He was shot through the shoulder and it severed his spine. He was taken below by his men, and his men quickly tried to avenge this brutal attack, looking in the rigging tops of the French ship for the sniper.
Suddenly, the British fleet was without its fearless leader. On HMS Victory, the British sailors were fighting hard during a crucial stage of the Battle of Trafalgar. While below decks, their admiral was fighting for his life. Admiral Nelson was shot only 15 minutes after Victory broke the enemy's line.
When Nelson is hit and wounded and taken below deck, the battle is still undecided. The fate remains in the balance.
At the heart of Nelson's genius as a leader was to get people to understand what they should do, even in the most dire of situations. His most fundamental order was that no captain could do wrong if he brought himself alongside an enemy and just fought them. It was up to every captain, every gun crew to keep on fighting.
As more and more British ships come in, the numerical balance is tipping in Britain's favour.
The Franco-Spanish vanguard of 10 ships Now began their slow turn to rejoin the fight. The British needed a decisive blow before that happened. It was on the gunners to keep pounding away.
Each gun crew would be well drilled, and they could load and fire these guns in 90 seconds. 90 seconds is incredibly fast for reloading and firing one of these guns. The French and Spanish couldn't keep up.
The French and Spanish were not trained in the same way. They did not have that same experience. They saw the British sailors as kind of devils. They described them as devils. How could people fire so much, so rapidly?
More and more British ships poured into the line. By 2 p.m., the huge Santissima Trinidad, target of multiple attacks, was a floating carcass. One of its sailors remembered.
She could not move. The English shot had torn our sails to tatters. It was as if huge invisible talons had been dragging at them. The ship creaked and groaned as she rolled, and through 1,000 holes and crevices in her hull, the sea spurted in and began to flood her hold.
At the same time, 3 more British ships raked the Bucentaure, leaving Admiral Villeneuve no choice but to surrender the French flagship.
At the same time, in the chaos of the battle, more and more of the French and Spanish ships are actually lowering their flags, indicating that they have surrendered. Nelson's tactic of trying to get an early numerical advantage has actually paid off.
By 4:15 p.m., a British victory is inevitable.
Captain Hardy comes down to the orlop deck of HMS Victory to tell Nelson that a victory has been achieved in the Battle of Trafalgar. Nelson is relieved. "Now I am satisfied," he said. "Thank God I have done my duty."
Nelson would die 15 minutes later. The British victory was resounding. 18 of the enemy's 33 ships were captured or destroyed. The Spanish suffered over 2,000 casualties, the French over 4,000. Though many, like Victory, were badly damaged, no British ship was lost.
The British defeat of the Franco-Spanish fleet during the Battle of Trafalgar was devastating to France and Spain as well. They lost control of the seas, therefore they had no ability to try and cross the Channel or invade Egypt or any of those opportunities that Napoleon sought to try and defeat the British.
The British victory did not end Napoleon's dominance over Europe, which would last another decade. But it gave Britain control of the oceans for the next century. The victory was bittersweet. The British had over 1,000 casualties, including their revered admiral.
The news of victory was greatly received in London, but the news of the death of Nelson caused people to show a public outpouring of emotion that really you would probably only be able to compare nowadays to the death of Princess Diana. People throughout the entire country were mourning the death of Nelson.
Today, Nelson's victory at Trafalgar is commemorated by one of London's most famous landmarks, and by the ship that made him a legend.
Victory is a unique survivor. She survived many battles. At Trafalgar, she was already 40 years old. And that's why it's so incredible that she survived. And it's through her fame. That's the reason we still have her today.
She is the only remaining ship of the line, the last witness to one of the greatest battles in naval history.